Hi guys, I hope you're doing really well. My name is Sarah and welcome to What the Horror, the channel where we talk about horror movies old and new. As you will have seen from the title and the thumbnail, today we are reviewing Immaculate, the recently released religious horror film. Immaculate was directed by Michael Mohan and stars Sydney Sweeney. Cecilia, an American nun of devout faith, embarks on a new journey in a remote convent in the picturesque Italian countryside. Cecilia's warm welcome quickly devolves into a nightmare as it becomes clear her new home harbours a sinister secret and unspeakable horrors. Immaculate was one that, I will be honest, was not high up on my most anticipated list, and I think that is mostly because I knew little to nothing about it. Now, I do enjoy religious horrors. I love The Exorcist and The Omen. They are some of my favourite horror movies, and I do also have a lot of enjoyment in the Conjuring universe, despite it being pushed to its limits of how many films you can reasonably make in the franchise. But Immaculate is one that I wanted to check out because it was a religious horror, but I went into this knowing next to nothing. I had seen clips of the trailer when I went to watch Imaginary, but I tried not to look at the screen too much in case, you know, a little bit too much was given away. But I am so glad that I went into this essentially blind. I had no idea about the story. I had no idea about the time setting. I had no idea about how bloody and gory it was. I knew nothing, and I'm so glad I did, because this was a wild ride. This movie, it goes places. Honestly, it's wild at times, and so I've decided to make this review spoiler free, because if you haven't seen it yet and you're trying to decide if you want to or not, I would love you to have the experience I did of going into it blind. Without spoiling anything though, I do want to mention that there are certain aspects of this film that are not going to be for everybody. There are some aspects in it that will just, you know, being completely transparent and honest, will be upsetting for people. If you are of a sensitive temperament, or you have particular topics in horror that are less enjoyable for you, I would say just do a little bit of research, but otherwise go into this film and just enjoy the wild ride that it is. So I want to talk a little bit more about the film, and often in my reviews I break it down into negatives, mixed aspects and positives. But I will be honest that while this is not a perfect film, I gave this 4 stars out of 5 on Letterboxd. While it's not perfect, there are for me no negatives. There are 0 negatives in this film. There is, however, one mixed element, which I will get into first, and then we will cover the multitude of positives. Okay, so the one mixed element in this film is unfortunately quite a big element of the film, and that is the horror and the scares. Unfortunately, Immaculate falls down the trap of many horror films of relying on one too many jump scares. And within that, they also very clearly signpost the jump scare that is coming. You have shots where Sydney Sweeney's character is in 1/3 of the frame and the second and third thirds are empty, and you know that something is gonna come from behind. There's the typical something smashes into a glass window, or someone turns to look in one direction and then there is something waiting for them in the other direction. Immaculate is not the first and will not be the last horror film guilty of falling into the jump scare trap. However, a lot of horror fans do not like jump scares, and I can understand that perhaps being a negative for them. For me, it never crossed into a negative because I could see they were coming, I knew what they were going to be, but the positives far outweighed this. So this was only a mixed element for me. Now that's the horror side of it, that's the jump scare side of it, but that is different from the atmosphere that the film creates, which I will talk about in the positives. So while I was never particularly scared, I was certainly uneasy and uncomfortable for good chunks of this film. Okay, moving on to positives, because there are many with this film. But the first one I want to talk about is the star of the film, Sydney Sweeney. I have never seen Sydney Sweeney in anything before. I haven't seen Euphoria, and I haven't seen the new rom-com she did this year with Glenn Powell. But my God, I was impressed. Sydney Sweeney is an incredible actor. She was really giving it her all in this film. And it could be that perhaps she gives her all in every role and every job that she has, but I can't help but wonder if it is in fact because she was also a producer on this film. Perhaps this is something that really meant something to her. She was really invested in it, in the story and making it, because she is giving her all in every single scene here. And Sydney Sweeney has such an incredible range as an actor, and there's a lot of the film where she is, I won't say hindered or held back, but her costume, the novices and then the nun's outfit, she has the habit on. So for a lot of it, you are only seeing her face, and then her body is covered in, very shapeless clothing. So a lot of her emotion and expression comes through her face and her eyes alone. And she can convey so much with her eyes and her facial expressions. I mean, when she's feeling awe and joy or fear and anger and sadness, all these different things, you're right there with her. She completely pulled me in. I believed every single moment, and it was catching almost. I could feel her pain, I could feel her joy, and it just made this character of Sister Cecilia so endearing. I honestly, very quickly in the runtime, just fell in love with this character. She was one that I wanted to support. She's interesting, well portrayed, and just an absolute glowing highlight of this film. And my God, can that woman scream. Woo! She honestly gives Jennifer Love Hewitt a run for her money. Incredible. Okay, the next big positive for me, and it is because it is one of my favourite things of the film, is the audio and the soundtrack. This film has some moments where there's very little dialogue to no dialogue, very little action, and you're having to convey so much and create the atmosphere, and they do so much of that through the sound of music. As, many films and TV shows do, but they do this so well. Because of the convent setting and the nuns, they actually use the chorus of the nuns singing as part of the audio. Sometimes it's diegetic, sometimes the nuns are actually singing within the scene, other times it's not, it's just an overlay. But there's other things as well, just the instruments, the use of nature sounds like birds and things like that. The convent is wonderful because you have lots of creaky floorboards and creaky doors. So the sound was one of my favourite aspects of this film, as were the visuals. Now, this is shot so beautifully. I don't know if it was Michael Mohan or his director of photography, but it was just beautiful. It is helped that they are set in the Italian countryside and this incredibly gorgeous convent structure that has beautiful ornate arches and I don't know what it's called, but it's like moulding on the ceiling. There's lots of golds and brasses and whites and terracottas, all set against blues and greens. Very visually pleasing, really ornate decorations in the convent as well, which just helps create this atmosphere where you tie that with the fact that even though it's set in modern day, I believe, it feels more like a period piece because you're using candles instead of electric lighting. There's, clothes drying outside naturally rather than using a machine. So the visuals of the landscape, but the building really give it this sort of period piece time feeling to it, and just sort of offsets that idea that it's the modern day and helps with feeling like something's just not quite right. The wardrobe as well in the visuals, absolutely beautiful. The costuming is done fantastically well, and there's not a wide variety. There are the novices sort of habits, and then you've got the nun ones, so you've got greys and blacks, lots of layers, heavy hanging cloth. But then you have the priests, the fathers, black ensemble, but then you also have the cardinals as well, which is a lot more richer and luxurious with golds and reds and things like that. So everything, it just feels picked so intricately and purposefully that it just, even if you were just watching it for the sound and the visuals, it's a win already. Now, I'm going to try and talk about the story, which is going to be quite difficult because I don't want to give any spoilers away, but I will just do sort of a general covering of my thoughts on the story. Now, like I said in the beginning, I went into this completely blind. There were some aspects of the film that I will say were quite standard, quite generic. So you'll be watching it, something will happen, and your brain, if you've watched enough horror films, will be able to fill in the gaps and kind of figure out the direction that it's going in. But having gone into it blind, I was still surprised and intrigued by the developments that first cropped up, and then I could sort of figure out the direction after that. I also think as well that this is not another The Nun. Not that I dislike the Nun films, but this is very much more going the way of The Omen and The Exorcist. It is a little bit more serious within itself. I think the story is definitely a lot darker. This could potentially be the darkest and most intense religious horror film I've ever seen in terms of story and content. It's also an interesting story when you consider certain other films that are being released this year. It's almost like Immaculate acts as an antithesis to another film that is coming out this year, and you've got sort of both sides of the coins, which I found a really good choice and a really interesting direction to go. I think that it's quite a simplistic story as well. There's not too much going on. There's not too many subplots or trying to stretch itself, over different narratives. There is the one thread of narrative that has a little adjacent subplot involving our sister Cecilia, but it is needed, it ties in, not too much attention is paid to it. And the simplicity, though, is never boring. It's never spread too thin. It evolves at a really good pace. It is a really interesting one. It's a really uncomfortable one as well, I think. And that's what I meant when I said earlier, just because the jump scares didn't land for me, the story itself, how distressing that can be at times, and the atmosphere that is created, it still managed to make me feel uncomfortable. And I will also say that while the horror and the jump scares are kind of generic, there are some really good instances of body horror and gore and bloody violence in this film, which I was not expecting at all. Some of the body horror ones, I will say, are kind of standard routes to go with body horror, but if you are squeamish at all, then there's going to be some moments where you look away. There was one in particular moment of body horror where I did have to kind of just glance down at my note. It was a little gross, but also kind of funny. That this one moment of body horror that I was a little squeamish with was also quite funny in a way. But yeah, definitely some moments of gore and violence, lots of blood, but it never feels like it crosses over into doing it for shock value. It never feels there, just because this is going to be our hook. It all has a place, it all makes sense, and they never cross the line with it. There is a particular element of the story where I was concerned when I realised that this was going to be a gory film, that we might see particular things. And the truth is the film never crossed that line. I know for some people it wouldn't be an issue, but for me it would have been. And I'm really glad that they always knew where that line was in terms of the gore and the shock value part of it, and they just stayed back from that, which won't make sense to you if you haven't seen the film, but if you have, you probably know which bit I'm talking about. There are some things we don't need to see, and I also think that leaving things to your imagination is far more effective. I also quite like the honesty of the film and how daring it is in some of the routes it goes with the storyline. I have noticed a lot recently with religious horror films that they are not ignoring certain aspects of the church. They are willing to point the finger and say, look, this happens, these things have occurred. The Pope's Exorcist with Russell Crowe last year did it as well, and this one does. It's a throwaway line, but I did respect it for having that honesty. And I think that, this film is quite brave in some of the things that it does include. You don't have to watch it that deeply, but if you do think about it a little bit more, what certain things are representing or being a theme of or a message of, there's some content in this film that might not be for everybody, and I don't just mean the gore or upsetting, I mean it might anger them a little bit. But I kind of love that. I love that horror films take chances. They ask the questions, they show us a mirror to society. That's the wonderful thing about horror. Some of them are daring and do make us feel uncomfortable because of what they're highlighting. So for me personally, I'm all for where Immaculate goes. One last thing that I want to point out as a positive is that Immaculate reminded me of multiple different films. So this isn't really a spoiler, but I suppose could perhaps be spoiler adjacent. So if you don't want any spoilers at all, then, maybe skip forward a little bit. But the opening of the film really reminded me of the opening of Invisible Man from 2020, in that it is no dialogue, but it is able to communicate so much to you in terms of the action and the way it's shot and the atmosphere that it builds. Immaculate hits the ground running. It immediately builds tension that may dip a little but never fully leaves. And it is such a well-structured opening scene that it just had me hooked from the beginning. There were also elements to it that reminded me of some Giallo films, most in particular Suspiria, and that is such a beautiful, wonderful film that again knows the strength in the visuals and the soundtrack, and Immaculate does the exact same thing. So I really appreciated that, and there was also elements of it that reminded me of Midsommar. Again, a beautifully crafted film, but while Immaculate reminded me of these really well-made films, it always knew its own identity. It was never trying to be something else. It was never trying to copy. It was simply magpieing ideas and working to its own strengths. Immaculate is its own film with its own identity. It knows what it is. It is not elevated horror. It never gets bogged down under the weight that some of those films carry. There is sort of a daftness to it as well. There are moments of lightheartedness and moments where you can sort of smile to yourself. So Immaculate knows what it is. It knows its identity and only uses influences to its advantage. So without getting into spoilers, there isn't much more that I can cover and talk about with this film. I am considering in my March recap of going into spoiler territory there. I might leave Immaculate till the end and talk a little bit more about spoilers. We'll see how long that episode is because we'll see how much I have watched. But if you would like to know some more in-depth thoughts on it and some spoiler territory, and would like to know perhaps the content that would be a little bit more unsettling, then definitely hit the notification bell so you don't miss my March recap, because I will go into it a little bit more there. But overall, I really loved Immaculate. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars and a heart. I wasn't going to give it a heart. I knew it was a 4-star, but as it has just, stuck around for a few hours, I've been able to process my thoughts on it. I've realised how good a film this actually is, despite some generic moments, despite a reliance on jump scares. So I gave it a heart as well. In my imaginary review, I said that going to the theatre these days is a luxury, and we don't all have the money to be going to see every single film. I would say Immaculate is worth seeing in the cinema. The sound and the visuals make it a worthwhile watch. However, if you are not sure about some of the content and, you can't afford the theatre, as, a lot of us can't, then I would say definitely check it out on streaming. This, for me, has so far been my favourite horror film of the year. I haven't seen Late Night with the Devil yet, but as of March, this is my favourite horror film, and it will be interesting to see how high up my list of ranking of 2024 horror films it will be. I'm imagining maybe top 5, definitely top 10. So that is my spoiler-free review of Immaculate. If you've seen the film, let me know down below. I'm desperate to talk to people about this film. Let me know if you've seen it, if you're planning on seeing it. Let me know your thoughts on religious horror as well, because we are getting a couple of entries in that subgenre this year as well. I know they're not for everyone. For me, they're so far removed from my life. I just find them fascinating, especially ones based around Catholicism, because there is all the element of the Pope and the Vatican and possession and all these kind of things, and there's so many ceremonies and visual elements to it that make it such an interesting topic. But I would love to know what you guys think of it. If you're new here and found me through this episode, then please do click the like button and the subscribe button to join the What the Horror family. This was actually a bonus episode this week. Normally I release on Sundays, so there will be another episode this week, which is going to be a recap of the original The Omen, in time for you to prepare for the release of the first Omen next week. April 5th, I believe. And if you would like to join this list of names here, then please do click the link to my Patreon page in the description box below. There will be lots of extra content for you. This week, my Patreon members have got a review of Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, which I saw at the weekend. But in the meantime, thank you as always for stopping by. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye.